Donald Trump's win. Vice President Kamala Harris will be there to read aloud those electoral votes as each state's results are counted. It's a masterclass in how these things work in the peaceful transition of power. Now, let's talk about the contrast that wasn't so peaceful 4 years ago. Today's event's drastically different compared to the scene that unfolded at the Capitol building. Thousands of Trump supporters descended on the steps of our nation's Capitol to stop the 2020 election certification of then President-elect Joe Biden. Well, it came just moments after the former president told the crowd of supporters, quote, to fight like hell, the words of now President-elect Donald Trump. Well, that attack left 5 people dead and at least 150 law enforcement officers injured. Still, lawmakers today confident that the process will run smoothly. House Speaker Mike Johnson had this to say moments before entering chambers.
The two houses will get together and we'll get it done, so stay tuned. This is a great day for the country. We're going to certify the election of Donald J. Trump as the 47th president. That's our focus today, so stay tuned for the rest of it.
And we have new polling on how Americans are feeling about those who participated in that attack. And look at the difference. In 2021, 21% of people approved of the action of rioters, 21%. Now that number has jumped to 30% who approve of the action of rioters. The number of Americans that disapproved of the attack dropped from 51% to 30%. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins us for more on this. Scott, pretty fascinating to see the change in numbers, and no doubt lawmakers are aware of that today.
Yeah, this was a riot that maimed police officers. They were gassed, they were beaten by hands, by bats, by hockey sticks, by chemical spray. That there's a shift in public opinion at all on this issue confuses any number of members of Congress who think unequivocally this was one of America's worst days and should always be remembered as such. But that really is the undertone to what's happening now inside the chamber as they certify this election. This is typically a ministerial task, one in which there's often far from perfect attendance. Happens in a matter of minutes, maybe close to an hour. It is a recitation that would even make a poli-sci professor yawn most years. Post-January 6th, obviously there's been a sea change in the awareness about the January 6th electoral certification. Republicans are touting their presence in the chamber after a snowstorm to be there to certify Donald Trump as the winner. This is not the sleepy affair it used to be, at least not this year.
At least not this year. Do you think that's why Vice President Kamala Harris put out that statement, went on camera, talking about the importance of doing her duty and being about the business of the people and just keeping this, as you say, ministerial?
Yeah, I think she wants to put any concerns to rest that this would be anything but an ordinary process, a ministerial process, as they call it. Also building a contrast, isn't she, between today and what happened 4 years ago, when not only was the electoral count disrupted, pushed back an entire day by the rioters, but obviously there was bloodshed, there was deaths, there were security threats. There were members of Congress trapped in that chamber January 6, 2021, texting their loved ones they worried they were about to die or be murdered at the hands of people chanting their names, saying, "Hang Mike Pence, where's Nancy Pelosi? I want to shoot her in the brain." That's what the rioters were saying outside the windows they smashed on January 6, 2021. Let's also read why this place is a fortress, even by congressional standards today. They have a Super Bowl-level security posture here with 8-foot black metal fencing surrounding the entire complex. Swarms of federal agents, Capitol Police, local police, law enforcement as far as the eye can see. Because of what happened 4 years ago, there's no intelligence that there was going to be a disruption today. There's still no sense anybody's going to object to this certification, but it is a different feel here. The aftermath, the storm cloud of that riot remains.
Well, and meanwhile, Scott, federal agencies continue investigating the people involved in that Capitol insurrection. What updates do you have, if any, on that front?
4 years to the mark, there have been 1,600 people charged for their role in the Capitol riot. That happens to be the largest criminal investigation and criminal prosecution in U.S. history. About 1,000 of them have pleaded guilty. They've acknowledged the crimes they committed. About 600 of them are accused of actually assaulting or resisting police officers physically. And about 600 people have gone to prison or are currently in prison. The promise of pardons for any number of defendants hangs over these proceedings. That could happen as early as 2 weeks from today, when outside the building, Donald Trump takes the oath of office.
But first, today's election certification. Scott McFarland, we know you are there to report on it. We expect to see you live on CBS Evening News as well. Thank you so much. All right, so Capitol Hill law enforcement and federal security agencies operating on high alert, as you just heard Scott say, they're going to be on high alert for the rest of the month because they really have a huge goal. They want to prevent another attack against Congress like the one that happened that Scott was talking about 4 years ago today. So for the security measures in place, we now go to CBS News Homeland Security and Justice reporter Nicole Skanga. Okay, Nicole, aside from the fact that it looks very cold where you are, give us a sense of those security measures. I see a lot of barricades there behind you.
Yeah, Reed, very cold where we are, very snowy, very wintry, but I can tell you, having stood here 4 years ago, the security posture looks like night and day compared to January 6, 2021. You can see just behind me this 8-foot steel ring that is surrounding so many of the federal buildings here downtown, some of the museums, and of course, the U.S. Capitol behind me. And part of the reason the posture has been stood up this way by federal and local law enforcement is because today is what's called a national special security event. That is the highest federal security proclamation that could be given. And what it does is it unlocks thousands of officers from across different federal agencies, not just U.S. Capitol Police and the U.S. Secret Service, but also, Park Police, ICE, CBP, FBI, all working here to ensure that this event is safe. And we are at a really historic moment right now because we actually have 3 of these kinds of national special security events happening within 15 days. Of course, today, the certification of the electoral count happening as we're speaking now. But in addition,
to that point, Nicole,
Jimmy
I want to
Carter,
jump in
former
because
president's funeral.
To that point, we want to jump in because it just started. Stay with us for a second. We want to let our viewers hear what you're talking about.
And count the votes of the electors of the several states for President and Vice President of the United States. After ascertainment has been had that the certificates are authentic and correct in form, the tellers will count and make a list of the votes cast by the electors of the several states. The tellers on the part of the 2 houses will take their places at the clerk's desk.
All right, so that was the first bit of business there. Kamala Harris calling that count into order. And now the approach to the desk and all of the formalities that happen. The gavel just before we were able to stop our conversation with Nicole, and Nicole is still standing out in the cold for us there. Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, at least for now. She hit the gavel and started. Let's listen now as it looks like we're going to begin again.
Without objection, the tellers will dispense with reading formal portions of the certificates. After ascertaining that the certificates are regular in form and authentic, the tellers will announce the votes cast by the electors for each state, beginning with Alabama. Senator Fisher.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Alabama seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 9 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 9 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Alaska seems to be regular in form and authentic. Therefrom, that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 3 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 3 votes.
All right, and so there you have it with the first 2 A's of the alphabet. They will continue going in alphabetical order, reading the certification right there, state by state, and this is how it will go for the next hour or so. Let's bring in Nicole Killian. Nicole, you have seen this, you have studied this, and it doesn't look like this is going to take a long time. It will just take about that long per state.
Well, this is a pretty routine procedure that has transpired in our nation's democracy for the better part of over 200 years. And so this is just formality in terms of certifying the results of the 2024 election. So what you're watching right now is that, as we heard the vice president there call for the tellers, and these are members of Congress representing each chamber. So this is done in a bipartisan and bicameral fashion where you have them kind of going through each state in alphabetical order, reading out that electoral count. We remember so much back in November on election night where we talked about that path to 270. And of course, each state has a certain number of electoral votes. And so those electors then are selected by the states. They certify the results on a state level, and then those certificates are then presented to Congress. So that is kind of what you are seeing them read out. That is Deb Fischer right there, who is a member of the Senate Rules Committee. Prior to that, we saw Amy Klobuchar, her counterpart, Democratic counterpart on the Senate Rules Committee. So they will continue to alternate kind of going through each state, again, reading out that electoral count. As we know, President-elect Trump won 312 electoral votes. So once they get through all 50 states and the District of Columbia, of course, the vice president will eventually read out those results once those tellers tally them and assemble their full count. So that is kind of what we are watching happen right now on the House floor in the House chamber. I would note right before the session started, it didn't look like the chamber was particularly full. We know that there are some members, of course, because there's a big snowstorm here in D.C., who may not have been able to make it back, but certainly enough to carry out this process as it should.
All right, Nicole Killian, thank you so much. Let's bring in CBS News Major Garrett now to have a conversation. Major, it's so striking to me to contrast what is happening today with what happened just 4 years ago, when this process that is a part, time immemorial of our democracy in action, the peaceful transition of power, was interrupted. Do you see this contrast as something that will also in and of itself make American history?
Of course it'll make American history. That history is being attempted to be rewritten right now. There are Republicans who want to either memory hole or whitewash what happened 4 years ago. 4 years ago was an attempt to overturn a presidential election that was legally held, verified by count after count in the disputed states, and was moving toward this formulaic certification. That certification process, the one that is playing out according to process and according to order right now, was disrupted 4 years ago. Why? Because an angry mob stormed the Capitol, broke inside, and threatened to take over the House chamber and the Senate chamber, sending lawmakers in both chambers, Senate and House representatives, fleeing for their lives and their safety. Their staffs in nearby House and Senate office buildings also felt threatened, and legitimately so. That was a violent attack to overturn a presidential election. And it was afterwards, many Republicans distanced themselves from then President Trump. There was an impeachment trial and a process which he survived. And then for the last 3.5 years, there has been a gradual, persistent, and we must underscore, successful political process by Donald Trump to make what happened 4 years ago today less than it appeared at the time. That succeeded politically does not take away the historical significance or the crimes committed on that day.
Well, and Major, a lot of people have said that was a national tragedy, what happened, and that's really speaking light on what happened 4 years ago. And under any other circumstances, you would expect on the 4-year mark after a national tragedy for lawmakers to have something to say about it. Are you hearing anything from Capitol Hill, from either side, that marks this 4-year mark since that tragedy?
Democrats are marking it in a very muted sort of way. When asked how do they feel about this, they will say, I remember this process 4 years ago. I remember the fear. I remember the injuries inflicted on Capitol and Metropolitan police officers defending the Capitol complex. Republicans aren't talking about it in any context other than Trump won, let's certify, let's get on with things, as if it never even happened. And again, that is a political response to a national tragedy. that political response prevailed in the 2024 election gives President-elect Trump what he regards as vindication. It's not legal vindication. It is political vindication. And there was a great clash between law and politics over this 2024 election and the unique refusal of a sitting president to accept a free and fair election in the country for the first time in our entire history. And that President-elect Trump is on the verge of returning to that office. Having done that, he says, proves that if he wasn't right in the particulars, he was right in the atmospheric outrage he felt about that election. His supporters felt it, and a sufficient number of Americans did not believe that disqualifying enough to deny him a return to the White House. That he's on his way back, for him, is the ultimate political victory.
Well, and let's talk about something that we heard over and over on the campaign trail by the president-elect, and that's the P word, pardons. What are some of the options that he has on his desk as it relates to pardons for the January 6th insurrectionists, Major?
So some 1,600 have either pled guilty or been convicted of crimes related to the riot on Capitol Hill on January 6th. Presidential powers are sweeping. They are, and the term of art is plenary. They cannot be challenged, not by Congress, not by the courts of law. Presidential pardon is absolute. So, President-elect Trump has said, when asked, that he will take these pardons on by a case-by-case basis. There are people in the Capitol complex circling it right this afternoon, advocating for everyone, even those who committed acts of violence repeatedly, either on their way up the Capitol steps or inside the Capitol, to give them full pardons. Violent criminals, essentially assaulting people, assaulting officers of the law, Capitol Police or Metropolitan Police, they should get pardons from President-elect Trump once he takes office. President-elect Trump hasn't said he's willing to go that far, but there is certainly political pressure to do that. I think it is quite clear he intends to pardon most, if not all, of those not convicted of or who pled guilty to the most serious acts of violence associated with January 6th.
What's so striking to me, Major, is also on the campaign trail, not only this election cycle, but the cycle before that, Donald Trump ran as a candidate who said over and over and over he was pro-police. And so in that environment, with those stated sentiments, it is also worth noting that police officers took the brunt of what happened on January 6th. So as we go into the consideration that a blanket pardon is one of the options, that's quite striking, is it not?
It is striking, and it's something that the American public debated. Certainly Democrats tried to pay attention to and play up for consideration in the presidential campaign. Many of the wounded officers lent their voice to that, saying, wait a minute, if this political party, the Republican Party, led by Donald Trump, is pro-police, how can it turn a blind eye to these acts of violence committed against us? And the political answer from the Trump universe was as follows. Those were police officers protecting a corrupt place and a corrupt system. They deserved, therefore, to be beaten up. That's the essence of the Republican and pro-Trump orientation to that question. Those police officers were defending something that, to their mind, was illegal or corrupt or some combination of the two. And therefore, their defense of that place, the Congress, their defense of the certification of a presidential election, they considered without foundation, without evidence, invalid, meant they deserved to get beaten up by the mob. That orientation is really important in our history, because if that orientation flows through the political actions taken by this incoming Trump administration, it will be based on the sense that there's no political cost to orient yourself to a law enforcement question like that in the future.
Well, and speaking to political costs, and I'm going to tell our directors and our producers in the back if we possibly can pull up the poll that we referenced earlier in this broadcast. I want to ask you, because it looks like there's been some erosion of sentiment regarding what happened on January 6th 4 years ago in how Americans feel about what happened on January 6th. Used to be more Americans then said that they did not approve of what happened on January 6th. And as of today, that polling showed that there are less people who question or have a problem with what happened there than when we first asked them 4 years ago. Is that a political win? Is that a showing of erosion that the January 6th Commission just did not make an adequate case to the American public with the facts?
It's a combination of things. One, Donald Trump learned this very early in life. Attack, attack, attack if you're on offense, and even if you lose or do something wrong, never admit defeat, never admit you were wrong. So his inflexibility on the question, right, of pushing forward on January 6th sent a message to the country that he was going to take the political risk to defend January 6th no matter what. Over time, people became less pleased with the Biden administration. That began to filter into their consideration of January 6th. They were unhappy with President Biden, so maybe they're less willing to condemn Trump over January 6th. All those things came together. Many Americans still consider January 6th a tragedy, but not enough politically for it to make a pivotal difference, rather, for Kamala Harris.
And we are seeing that poll there on the screen. Then 21% approving of the January 6th actions, now 30%. And strongly disapprove on one of 2021, 51%, now 30% strongly disapprove. Major Garrett, we appreciate the conversation today. We want to now talk to Nicole Skanga, CBS News Homeland Security and Justice reporter. Nicole, you were there that day 4 years ago, and you see these polling numbers right there. How does that hit your ears as somebody who was there and witnessed it in real time?
Reed, I want to remind our viewers of what exactly played out on that day. My crew that is here with us today, Omar, Steve, myself, we were all here 4 years ago, and we witnessed as members of far-right extremist groups, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the 3 Percenters, assembled, creating paramilitary formations, wearing tactical gear, carrying weapons, many of them turning an American flag and an American flagpole into a weapon. And they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, where I'm standing right now, chanting, many of them, deploring not only lawmakers on Capitol Hill, but also some of the media who was covering that day's events. I had a colleague who lost his camera when it was burnt by some of the rioters here. At many points in time, we had to duck and cover out of fear of our own safety. It was a very, very different scene. And 20 years after 9/11, really a wake-up call to the intelligence community at all. Many aftermath action reports written, Reed, but it stands out to me 4 years later that no one within the intelligence community had flagged that these were happening. As far as the public perception, it's certainly evolved, and time has a funny way of whitewashing history, but I have a fierce recollection of just how dangerous that day was, watching law enforcement, Capitol Police officers really in hand-to-hand combat with some of these rioters. You see the bike racks that are next to me here. I'm reminded of the bike racks that so many of the rioters had pushed, knocking law enforcement down as they made their way into the U.S. Capitol, breaking the windows. So just such a stark comparison. Not only today have we seen intelligence leading up to this event, but truly as a national special security event, there's just been an enormous amount of focus on ensuring that something like what happened on January 6, 2021 never happens again.
Well, and for our viewers who are just now tuning in, whether on your television set, your computer, in the palm of your hand, if you're just joining us, we're having this conversation with Nicole Skanga and our other CBS News experts and correspondents as Congress begins the process to certify the 2024 election results ahead of that Trump inauguration. But speaking to that contrast, you were there 4 years ago. You say you felt at times that you were in danger for your own life. Is that why we're seeing so many security barricades all around you today, Nicole, out there in the cold?
Yeah, and you can see that there's 8-foot steel walls, fencing erected beside me. Yes, of course, it is, protecting some of these federal buildings that are actually closed today because of, all of this weather. But these will actually remain up through the inauguration read. And we should point out, we were talking before the electoral count, that certification process unfolded, that we have a really unprecedented lineup of high-profile security events happening in Washington this week and in the coming weeks. So today, of course, January 6th. But also in a couple of days, the funeral for former President Jimmy Carter, which is also a national special security event. And then January 20th, we have the inauguration. It doesn't get more high profile than that when it comes to security. And we will see a number of protests, play out in between now and then here in the nation's capital. So, we always say law enforcement on high alert, but this time around, again, really an unprecedented posture for federal agencies, across the board, FBI, United States Secret Service, U.S. Capitol Police, all who are working in tandem to protect these events. And we should point out that all of this sort of winter weather is contributing in a challenging way. Of course, nothing changing what's happening on the Hill today, but we do know that right now they're actually erecting behind us some heating stations that will be up ahead of, former President Carter's funeral to ensure that everyone is safe. We could see a change perhaps in the funeral procession route. And oftentimes we should note that, security here in Washington, D.C. uses snow plows to block some of the streets, sort of hardening some of the security around the nation's capital and around the Capitol building. Obviously, those snow plows very hard at work today. So some contingency planning bound to happen, in the coming days, just to ensure that this posture is what it needs to be, frankly, for such a, high-profile series of events. None of which is happening in a vacuum, Reed, by the way, in the aftermath of the attacks in New Orleans and, of course, the explosion of the Tesla Cybertruck in Las Vegas. Law enforcement in an even more heightened state and on the lookout for copycat attacks.
CBS News' Nicole Skanga, thank you so much. Nicole, I want you to go sit in the van and warm up your hands, my friend, or at least put them in your jacket and get warm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's nice streaming with you. So continuing the conversation, deepening it, let's bring in CBS News senior investigative data journalist Steve Riley to the stream. Steve, you really did a deep dive on the January 6th Capitol insurrectionists and their criminal histories. Take us through what you found out.
Well, thanks for having me. Yes. So as we heard Major Garrett say, nearly 1,600 people have been charged with crimes tied to the Capitol insurrection. That includes more than 170 charged with using a deadly or dangerous weapon or causing serious bodily injury to a law enforcement officer. And since then, more than 1,000 defendants have pleaded guilty, and about 220 more were convicted at trial. And what my colleagues and I did was scour federal sentencing records in order to see which defendants have prior criminal records. Now, we did this by analyzing the sentencing memoranda that federal prosecutors file for every defendant who's sentenced in these cases. What we found were nearly 160 defendants in these Capitol breach cases have prior criminal records. Many of them are for minor offenses, but some were for serious criminal histories that we reported on today.
Pretty fascinating to see that correlation. Any cases in particular catch your attention among the defendants?
There's a broad range among these defendants who have prior criminal histories about what their records show. Some, like I said, were for minor offenses. Couple, single convictions over the course of their lives. Others were highlighted by DOJ prosecutors as having long criminal histories. One that might stand out is a defendant named Peter Schwartz. DOJ prosecutors in their sentencing memorandum said Mr. Schwartz had a, quote, jaw-dropping history of criminal offenses, nearly 38 prior convictions going back to 1991. Several of which involved assaulting or threatening officers or other authority figures.
All right. Well, fascinating to see a deep dive on who these people are. No doubt President-elect Donald Trump is going to be doing the same if he hasn't already, because on the campaign trail, he talked about pardons. It will be fascinating to see if he does a blanket pardon or if he definitely takes it case by case. and if he does, whether he will take into account their criminal histories. Thank you so much for talking to us today on CBS News 24/7. So let's bring in CBS News political reporter Aaron Navarro. He's live in West Palm Beach right now. Aaron, usually I talk to you when you're on the campaign trail. We are now very well past the campaign trail, and now we have a president-elect and a vice president-elect. Any word out of Mar-a-Lago as to what is playing out in Washington, D.C. right now in the halls of Congress?
Reed, good to be with you. We know that Trump posted this morning about the certification. He wrote, quote, "Congress certifies our great election victory today, a big moment in history." We are expecting to hear more from the president-elect and his transition team after the whole certification process is wrapped up later this afternoon.
Jump in and go back to Washington, D.C. with gratitude for some of that information that you were able to give us in West Palm Beach, because they are now ending the count there with the last few states. We want to let our viewers hear the last few states being read. Let's go ahead and do that.
The state of Minnesota received 13 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Washington seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Kamala D. Harris of the state of California received 12 votes for president, and Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota received 12 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of West Virginia seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 4 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 4 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the great state of Wisconsin seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 10 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 10 votes for vice president.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Wyoming seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 3 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 3 votes for vice president.
Members of Congress, the certificates having been read, the tellers will ascertain and deliver the result to the President of the Senate.
The undersigned, Deb Fisher and Amy Klobuchar, tellers on the part of the Senate, and Brian Steele and Joseph Morelli, tellers on the part of the House of Representatives, report the following as the result of the ascertainment and counting of the electoral vote for President and Vice President of the United States for the term beginning on the 20th day of January, 2025.
The state of the vote for the President of the United States.
The electoral votes from each state are counted, and Vice President Kamala Harris will carry out her constitutional duty as President of the Senate, overseeing the certification of Donald Trump's victory. Harris has accepted the 2024 results. Let's listen in.
Votes. Kamala D. Harris. Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 226 votes. The whole number of electors appointed to vote for Vice President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for Vice President of the United States are as follows. J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio has received 312 votes. Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota has received 226 votes. This announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, each for a term beginning on the 20th day of January 2025, and shall be entered together with the list of the votes on the journals of the House and the Senate. Thank you very much.
The Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, receiving a standing ovation there as she stands just to the right of the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson.
The purpose of the Joint Senate having been concluded pursuant to
She's
Senate
wrapping it up there in her ceremonial role as Vice President and President of the Senate there. This, of course, usually a ceremonial and uneventful as January 6th, something we don't normally come on the air to cover. But 4 years ago, you will recall that thousands of pro-Trump rioters stormed the U.S. Capitol, resulting in millions of dollars in damage. 140 officers were wounded. People died on that day. We were live on the air for more than 9 hours covering that assault on the U.S. Capitol. And so today, you witness again the peaceful transfer of power. With me here is Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa. And Robert, the President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris trying to present that this is the peaceful transfer of power, and that they acknowledge that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States.
Nora, good to be with you. As you said, this is a ceremonial moment for American democracy, a tradition to have the vice president oversee the congressional certification of a presidential election. But as you noted as well, it's important. It's important for American democracy and for the American people to see this unfold in real time. The country is functioning, even at a time of deep political divisions. And it brings back memories historically of January 1961, when Vice President Richard Nixon had to oversee the certification of John F. Kennedy's victory. You think back to January 6, 2001, when Al Gore had to certify the election of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. Mike Pence, in January of 2021, was under pressure from now President-elect Trump to overturn the election. But Pence, as we've deeply reported here at CBS, decided not to use this moment for any political purpose. He oversaw the certification of that election. And so we see once again the functioning of American democracy on the House of Representatives floor. You see the Vice President, Kamala Harris, meeting with the congressional delegation, J.D. Vance, the Vice President-elect, shaking hands right there on the House floor. This was a bitterly fought election at many turns. But here is J.D. Vance, Kamala Harris, allies of both of these campaigns, mingling in the place they all convene to conduct the business of the people. And when Vice President Harris walked into the Capitol today, Nora, she was asked by reporters, what does this all mean to you? And she replied in one sentence, it means democracy must be upheld by the people.
An excellent point, Robert Costa. Thank you. Want to bring in our congressional correspondent, Scott McFarland, on Capitol Hill. Scott, the Capitol on lockdown today, given what happened 4 years ago, designated for the first time in history as a national special security event. You have done some of the most extensive reporting of any journalist on what happened January 6, 4 years ago, and what has become the largest single investigation the Justice Department has ever undertaken into those that stormed on January 6th and committed that violence. What can you report to us today about the status of those, Scott?
This remains the largest criminal investigation and prosecution in U.S. history, Nora, still ongoing 4 years after the day. And this all happened today in a driving snowstorm here in Washington. Some of those members had to fight through the snow to be there. But to be clear, there's also this metaphorical storm cloud hanging over the Capitol. People have not erased the memories of January 6, 2021. When they did this last time, the fumes of chemical spray were in the air. There was blood on the Capitol floors, human waste on the walls. There were wounded, maimed, gassed, beaten police officers recovering from injuries. That's what happened last time. And one of the men who was running that proceeding just now, the Democrat who is top on the House Administration Committee, Joe Morelli of New York, he administered the task there. He told me before walking on the floor, he's worried all of this has been whitewashed. There were no vigils organized by Republican leaders who now control the House and Senate. There is a January 6 plaque to honor police officers mandated by law. It's never been hung. And no discussion of January 6th by House leaders as they walk to the floor today. As for the prosecutions, as of today, there are now about 1,600 federal defendants, 1,000 of whom have admitted their crimes. They've pleaded guilty. About 600 of them are accused of assaulting and resisting police officers, and not just with their bare hands, but with bear spray, knives, flagpoles. Nor there were guns brought by some of the rioters that day. One of them shot the gun outside the Capitol. None of this is happening in a vacuum. This historic moment on the House floor is quite a contrast from 4 years ago.
Scott McFarland on Capitol Hill. Scott, thank you. I want to bring in Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes, who is outside in that snowstorm that we have witnessed here in our nation's capital today. And Nancy, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, taking to print today to make sure that people don't forget what happened 4 years ago. What have you learned?
Hello, Nora. Yes, good afternoon from a very snowy White House, and especially White House. And you're right, the president and the vice president today have been looking to underscore in understated but serious ways the importance of what happened at the Capitol that we watched unfold before our very eyes 4 years ago, to ensure that it isn't whitewashed, as some have tried to do by insisting that somehow that was a day of love or a peaceful protest. So you saw the vice president, who we all just watched carry out her constitutional obligation on Capitol Hill. She released a video before all of that started this morning. Quick video just to say that the certification of the election is one of her duties, and that it is a very important part of democracy. She said the peaceful transfer of power is one of the most fundamental principles of American democracy. Translation, she, of all people, may not like the outcome of the election, but she is going to do her duty because that is what the Constitution demands. That's what democracy demands. And that's, of course, famously what Donald Trump did not want his own vice president, Mike Pence, to do 4 years ago on this very day. President Biden released an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday entitled "What Americans Should Remember About January 6th." He, as well, looking to underscore what happened there. He said that an unrelenting effort has been underway to rewrite, even erase, the history of that day. He said that that history needs to be told and repeated because any nation that forgets its past is doomed to repeat it, Nora.
Nancy Cordes at the White House. Want to bring in Robert Costa one more time. And as the President of the United States says, wants to make sure that people don't forget what happened on January 6th, the President-elect Donald Trump has said he is going to very, very seriously consider pardoning some or almost all of those 1,600 defendants.
And one quick note for history. 4 years ago, so much of January 6th was not just the mob attacking the U.S. Capitol. It was the wave of objections from lawmakers. Today, Nora, not one single lawmaker objected to the certification of the most recent presidential election. And what a comeback for President-elect Donald Trump. Stunning in terms of American political history to go from being the president who oversaw January 6, 2021 to being a criminal convict in May of 2024. Now he's the president-elect of the United States, and the investigations of January 6 on the federal level have fallen away as he prepares to take office.
As you point out, even Donald Trump rebuked by the top members of his own party in Congress on that day 4 years ago on January 6th and called on him to call off the rioters. Robert Costa, thank you to all of our correspondents, producers, and crews for covering this day. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news. And tonight on the CBS Evening News, this has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Norah O'Donnell.
Our thanks to Nora and her team. Now we continue, as Nora mentioned, on CBS News 24/7 with this conversation. Let's go back to CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett. Major, we've been watching the handshaking down there on the floor. Looks like Vice President-elect J.D. Vance is the one a lot of people want to have photographs. What were your impressions as you watched now Vice President Kamala Harris go through that very procedure that now cements the 2024 election results?
So when you cover Congress, and I did so for almost 20 years, you hear a phrase, Reed, regular order. What is regular order? That's the process by which the rules of either the House or the Senate are followed and everyone agrees to follow them. Why does that matter? Because in times like this, regular order is what produces the stability that undergirds the peaceful transfer of power. The language read by the vice president presiding over this process was very specific. The electoral certificates that she was counting were presented as regular in form and authentic. Those are not words that are just taken out of the dictionary randomly. They're part of the process by which we have historically decided that what happened in any given state is reflective of the vote in that state, and those electors therefore should be certified and credibly counted by Congress to convey not just to our country, but to the world that a peaceful transfer of power is about to commence and the election is over and now fully and completely verified and certified. Why do I bring that up? Because 4 years ago, there was a malevolent attempt inside the Trump White House to create alternate, non-regular, non-authentic certificates of the electors, phony ones, to masquerade as the intent of the voters in those disputed states, to overturn a verified and legally held presidential election. It was a shocking moment in American history. It will, regardless of the political verdict rendered in 2024 about January 6, 2021, always be a historical stain and a legal stain on this country. Regular order matters. What we are seeing is the preservation of regular order and, in no small part, its resurrection this afternoon here in Washington, D.C., and that it is bipartisan and collegial is, at one level, refreshing.
You know, Major, as a writer, one of my favorite books on writing is called The Situation and the Story, Vivian Gornick. The situation 4 years ago was what it was. The story was what it was, but now it seems that there's an evolution in the retelling of the story. Given the vast information the January 6th Commission came up with, will today get in the way of all of these truths being told for generations to come? This moving on sort of energy that we're seeing in Congress?
It will depend in great measure on the actions of the second Trump administration, because if the actions of the second Trump administration live within the contours of regular order, do not take on within the executive branch extravagant new powers that have never been claimed by a president to do things in regards to immigration or the military or other realms of American life. If the second Trump administration lives within the contours of our Constitution, of laws passed by Congress, of previous precedents, holding in and restraining some of the powers of the presidency, then it will mean one thing. If this second Trump term goes in excessive directions, new directions, and expands the power of the presidency or ignores legal challenges or tries to overturn regular order in Congress by some mechanism, political, persuasive, or otherwise, then we will have to look back on January 6th, 2021 as a foreshadowing of new and aggressive powers within the executive branch to, if not topple, certainly rewrite the way we understand what regular order and process in this country is. So much of how we remember and how much of a turning point January 6, 2021 will depend on the actions of the second Trump administration. And to that point, let me make one thing very clear. There was a period of time after January 6, 2021 in which Donald Trump was in a kind of political wilderness. And the people who hung out with him then, who did not abandon him despite what he did and what he helped foment on January 6, 2021, are part of his tightest inner circle now. He regards them as his chief and most important loyalists. So those who looked at January 6th and said, I see nothing wrong here, were close then, they are close now, they will be closer still inside the White House when he is inaugurated on January 20th.
Close now with an ear to the incoming president and arguably with a lot of power. Major Garrett, thank you so much for the conversation and for your years of covering Congress and helping us to see this through that context. We appreciate it. So let's talk about the what's next. Let's bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian live from Capitol Hill. Okay, Nicole, you saw it play out there. Striking there to watch Vice President Kamala Harris conduct the business of the people as she said she would. It's fascinating to look at how this could affect her personally and also politically. What are your impressions there about how the world will remember Kamala Harris after today politically?
Well, I think you saw her there get due respect from both sides of the aisle, certainly on the part of Democrats who gave her a standing ovation when she read out her name and the results, even though she was defeated by the president-elect. So from that standpoint, I think there is still a lot of admiration and appreciation for the very abbreviated campaign that she ran. And look, she made clear before she went into the chamber that she believes that this is a sacred obligation, serving as president of the Senate, serving as vice president, carrying out something that is constitutionally mandated. You know, she felt an obligation. I mean, at the end of the day, she is doing her job. And she told reporters as she headed into the chamber when she was asked about kind of how she was feeling and what this day means to her, she replied by saying that democracy should be upheld by the people. So she really is kind of stood there very stoically, even though it may have been very difficult for her personally to again kind of relive what was a very bitter and heated election. But at the end of the day, recognizing the greater good, the greater importance of fulfilling her constitutional duty by overseeing the certification of this election.
And then you see to her left, of course, Mike Johnson, who did not have an easy time last week when we talked in the nomination process when the lawmakers, I'm being told to go to someone else right now. So we're going to jump off of that question. Nicole, I thank you for your time. Let's go to, who are we going to, producer? You got my ear. Okay. CBS News election law contributor David Becker for more on this process. So take us through the process. And my apologies to Nicole. We should have let Nicole finish her answer there. But anyway, go ahead and take us through the process.
Yeah, I mean, what we just saw took about 30 minutes, and that was what it should be. It's just counting electoral votes that we already know exist. We already know the outcome. Vice President Harris did her duty as every other vice president has done before, including Vice President Pence, including Vice President Gore, who oversaw the certification of his own defeat, including Vice President Nixon, who oversaw the certification of his own defeat in 1961. And so we should remember that by this time, 4 years ago, the House was already, or the Congress was already under siege. There were members of Congress who were fleeing, who were hiding. There were calls to hang Mike Pence. And at this point, what we just saw was exactly as it's always been done in every year but 2021 in modern American history, which is members of Congress performed their duty. We didn't see a single objection to any of the state's electoral votes. All of the electoral votes were regularly given, and this is as it should be.
All right, and I'll ask you the same question I was going to ask Nicole Killian there. You saw almost a cordial sense there between now Vice President Kamala Harris and House Speaker Mike Johnson. That could be a double-edged sword for him politically, because we know that some of his detractors there, his Republican detractors in Congress, felt like, given the bipartisan nature of the spending bill and some of his work to reach across the aisle, was a political liability for him. How did you read what went on between Kamala Harris and the Speaker?
I think it was just a very human moment between two public servants who obviously have a lot of disagreements politically. Speaker Johnson was seeing the certification of the presidential election that he was happy with. He was happy with the outcome. Vice President Harris clearly wasn't. But it's important to see these leaders acting as human beings in a cordial manner. Major Garrett mentioned this before. This is the way it's supposed to be done. This is the most ceremonial and ministerial thing Congress is going to do. This should be the least contentious thing that Congress is going to do. Much less contentious is what we saw in the election of a speaker just a few days ago. And so this should be the moment for everyone to come together and just acknowledge what the American people decided. That's what they did. Kudos to them for that. They shouldn't be doing anything else, but obviously it stands in stark contrast to what we saw just 4 years earlier, when members of Congress who were trying to do their duty were under attack.
Well, and before we leave you in about 20 seconds, it bears mentioning that the next time we will see these leaders close together will be Inauguration Day, when President-elect Donald Trump, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance will share the stage on Inauguration Day with outgoing President Joe Biden and outgoing Vice President Kamala Harris. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much for watching history play out right here on CBS News 24/7. There you have it. When we see it, you see it. Congress has now certified the 2024 election results, paving the way for the inauguration of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance.
Politics isn't a game. The data says you do have a women problem. Politics is about policy. Isn't that giving people false hope? I'm a voracious consumer of information, and I'm impatient. I don't like to be spun. To be moderator of Face the Nation is not an anchor. It's not an actress. You are up here to moderate a conversation.